A gunshot echoed across the vast Wyoming prairie as Eliza Rose clutched her side, blood seeping through her fingers as she stumbled forward through the tall grass. The year was 1887, and she had just escaped the clutches of the man who'd promised to be her protector but had become her tormentor instead. Her wedding band had been discarded miles back, along with any hope for the life she'd once envisioned for herself. The late August sun beat down mercilessly on her exposed shoulders, the dress she wore torn at the sleeve from her desperate escape. Her throat burned with thirst, and her vision began to blur as the blood loss and heat took their toll. The distant silhouette of mountains wavered like a mirage, and Eliza knew she wouldn't make it much farther. Her legs finally gave way beneath her, and she collapsed into a sea of golden prairie grass. As consciousness slipped away, she thought she heard the distant thunder of hooves approaching. Her last coherent thought was a desperate prayer that whoever was coming would show more mercy than the man she'd fled. Ethan Zimmerman pulled back on the reins of his chestnut mare as he spotted something unusual in the distance, a splash of faded blue fabric against the amber grass. At 26, he'd spent enough years on the frontier to know that anything out of place could mean trouble. He approached cautiously, his hand hovering near the revolver on his hip. What he found stopped him cold. A woman lay unconscious, her face pale as milk against the sun-burnished field. Blood stained her dress at the waist, and her breathing came in shallow, uneven gasps. Dismounting quickly, Ethan knelt beside her, checking for signs of life. She was burning with fever, but still alive. He gently rolled her to assess the wound, finding a bullet graze along her side painful and bloody, but not immediately life-threatening if properly treated. "Miss," he called, tapping her cheek lightly. "Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes the color of spring violets. Fear flashed across her face when she saw him, and she tried weakly to push away. "Easy now," Ethan said softly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not going to hurt you. You're wounded and need help. He'll find me," she whispered, her voice cracking with thirst and fear. "Who will?" Ethan asked, already reaching for his canteen, but she'd slipped back into unconsciousness. Ethan knew he couldn't leave her here. The nearest town was Verde, a good 15 miles away, and she wouldn't survive that long without care. His ranch was closer, just 3 miles over the next rise. He carefully lifted her into his arms, surprised at how light she felt despite the full skirts of her dress. Her head lolled against his shoulder as he mounted his horse, situating her across his lap. "Then my arms are your shelter," he murmured, not entirely sure why those words came to him. "At least until we get you somewhere safe." Urging his horse forward, Ethan rode carefully back toward his ranch, the mysterious woman secure in his hold. She stirred occasionally, murmuring incoherent words and once crying out in such pain that it wasn't from her wound alone, but from something deeper. Ethan's jaw tightened. He'd seen enough of the world to recognize when someone had been running from something or someone. The Lazy Z Ranch came into view as they crested the last hill, a modest spread with a sturdy 2-story house, a barn, and several outbuildings. It wasn't the largest ranch in the territory, but Ethan had built it himself over the past 5 years, and pride swelled in his chest whenever he returned home. "Martha," he called as he rode into the yard. "Come quick." The door to the house swung open, and a stout woman in her 50s hurried down the steps, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes widened at the sight of the unconscious woman in Ethan's arms. "Lord above, what's happened?" Martha Wilkins had been Ethan's housekeeper since he'd established the ranch, coming to work for him after her husband died in a mining accident. "Found her out in the north field," Ethan explained as he dismounted carefully, still cradling the woman. "She's been shot, though it looks like a graze. She's running a fever too. Bring her in," Martha instructed, already turning back to the house. "I'll get the spare room ready and heat water." Ethan carried the woman upstairs to the small bedroom at the end of the hall. Martha had already turned down the bed covers and was laying out clean linens and her box of medical supplies. "You'll need to step out while I tend to her," Martha said firmly. "I'll need to get these dirty clothes off and clean that wound properly." Ethan nodded, reluctantly leaving the room. He paused at the door. She said something about someone finding her. "Keep the shotgun close, Martha. I don't know what trouble she's in, but I'd rather be prepared." While Martha tended to their unexpected guest, Ethan checked his property, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. The vast Wyoming landscape remained peaceful, with only the occasional hawk circling overhead and cattle grazing in the distance. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had shot the woman might come looking for her. After ensuring the horses were properly stabled and giving instructions to his ranch hands to keep watch, Ethan returned to the house. Martha was coming down the stairs, carrying a basin of pink-tinged water. "How is she?" Ethan asked. "The wound isn't too deep, but it's angry and hot." "She's fevered something fierce," Martha replied, setting down the basin. "I cleaned it as best I could and got some broth into her, though she's barely conscious. She'll need a doctor if that fever doesn't break by morning." "I'll ride to Verde at first light if needed," Ethan said. "Did she say anything? Her name, perhaps?" Martha shook her head. "Nothing that made sense, just pleading with someone not to find her." She paused, her expression troubled. "Ethan, there's something else. She has bruises, old ones on her arms and back. And a mark around her neck like someone tried to choke her." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Someone's been hurting her for a while then. Seems that way," Martha sighed. "I've seen it before. My sister went through something similar with her first husband. That poor girl up there has been living in fear for some time, I'd wager." "She's safe here now," Ethan said firmly. "Whatever she's running from won't find her at the Lazy Z." Through the night, Ethan and Martha took turns sitting with the mysterious woman. Her fever raged, causing her to thrash and cry out, sometimes begging unseen tormentors to leave her alone. By dawn, Ethan was preparing to ride to Verde for the doctor when Martha called down from upstairs. "Ethan." Her fever's breaking, relief washed over him as he took the stairs 2 at a time. In the small bedroom, the woman lay still, her face no longer flushed with fever but pale and drawn. Her breathing had steadied, and when Martha placed a damp cloth on her forehead, her eyes fluttered open for a moment. Confusion clouded those violet eyes, then panic. She tried to sit up but fell back with a gasp of pain. "Easy there," Martha soothed. "You're safe. No one's going to hurt you here." "Where am I?" the woman asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're at the Lazy Z Ranch, about 15 miles west of Verde," Ethan said, keeping his distance so as not to frighten her. "I found you unconscious in the north field yesterday. You'd been shot." Her hand went to her side, feeling the bandages beneath the nightgown Martha had dressed her in. "You helped me. Couldn't very well leave you there," Ethan said with a slight shrug. "I'm Ethan Zimmerman. This is Martha Wilkins, my housekeeper." The woman hesitated, clearly weighing whether to trust them with her name. Finally, she said, Eliza Rose." "Well, Miss Rose, you're welcome to stay here until you're healed," Ethan offered. "No one will bother you." Tears welled in Eliza's eyes, but she blinked them away quickly. "I can't stay. He'll be looking for me." "Who will?" Martha asked gently. "My husband," Eliza replied, her voice hardening despite its weakness. "Former husband, as far as I'm concerned, though he doesn't see it that way." Ethan and Martha exchanged glances. "The man who shot you?" Ethan asked, though he already knew the answer. Eliza nodded. "Victor Blackwell. He owns half the businesses in Cheyenne and thinks he owns me as well." She looked down at her ringless finger. "I left him 3 days ago. He caught up to me yesterday morning, and he shot you," Martha gasped. "He said if he couldn't have me, no one would," Eliza said simply, as if reciting a fact as common as the weather. "I managed to get away when his horse spooked at the gunshot. I ran until I couldn't anymore." Ethan's hands clenched into fists. He'd heard of men like Blackwell, wealthy, powerful, and used to taking what they wanted with no consequences. "Well, he won't find you here," Ethan stated firmly. "The Lazy Z isn't on many maps and we don't get many visitors. You can stay as long as you need." "I can't impose," Eliza began. "Nonsense," Martha interrupted. "You need rest and proper care. That wound could still turn bad if you push yourself too soon." Eliza looked like she wanted to argue further but was too exhausted. "Thank you," she finally said. "Just for a few days until I can travel again." "We'll see," Martha replied in a tone that brooked no argument. Now, how about some proper food? You must be starving. As Martha bustled off to prepare a meal, Ethan lingered at the doorway. Miss Rose, I know it's not my place to ask, but does your husband have connections in Verdi? Would anyone there recognize you? Eliza shook her head. I don't think so. We never traveled this far west together. His business interests are mainly in Cheyenne and Laramie. Good, that gives us some breathing room, Ethan said. Rest now, we can talk more when you're stronger. The days that followed settled into a cautious routine. Eliza grew stronger under Martha's attentive care, the wound on her side healing cleanly. After a week, she was able to move around the house, though she tired easily. Ethan made sure to keep his distance, recognizing that his presence as a man might be unsettling after what she'd been through. For her part, Eliza seemed to relax incrementally with each passing day. She helped Martha with simple kitchen tasks when she could, and spent hours gazing out the window at the vast Wyoming landscape, as if reassuring herself that her tormentor wasn't on the horizon. One evening, as Martha was showing Eliza how to make her famous apple pie, Ethan returned from checking on a pregnant mare to find the kitchen filled with laughter. The sound stopped him in his tracks. It was the first time he'd heard Eliza truly laugh, and something about it warmed him in a way he hadn't expected. What's so amusing? He asked, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. Oh, Martha was just telling me about the time you tried to break that wild Mustang and ended up in the water trough, Eliza explained, her cheeks flushed with mirth. Betrayed by my own housekeeper, Ethan said with mock indignation, though he couldn't help but smile at seeing Eliza so animated. Every man needs someone to keep him humble, Martha retorted, sliding the pie into the oven. And that horse did a fine job of it. Thunder and I came to an understanding eventually, Ethan defended himself. He's one of my best cutting horses now. Is Thunder the black stallion I see in the corral sometimes? Eliza asked. He's beautiful. That's him, Ethan confirmed, pleased by her interest. Would you like to meet him properly sometime, when you're feeling stronger, of course? Something flickered in Eliza's eyes, a hesitation, then a cautious hope. I'd like that. I used to love riding before. She trailed off, the shadow of her past momentarily darkening her expression. Before is before, Martha said firmly, patting Eliza's hand. Now is now. And now we have pie to look forward to. That night, after Martha had retired to her room and Eliza had gone upstairs, Ethan sat on the porch, nursing a cup of coffee and watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. The sound of the screen door opening caught his attention, and he turned to see Eliza standing there, wrapped in a shawl against the evening chill. May I join you? She asked hesitantly. Of course, Ethan replied, rising to offer her the rocking chair. She sat carefully, mindful of her healing wound. For a while they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, the occasional lowing of cattle, the soft nickering of horses in the barn, the distant howl of a coyote. I never thanked you properly, Eliza finally said. For finding me that day, for bringing me here. No thanks needed, Ethan assured her. Anyone would have done the same. Eliza's laugh was soft and bitter. No, they wouldn't have. I've learned that the hard way. She looked at him directly. Why did you help me, truly? Ethan considered the question, wanting to give her an honest answer. My pa raised me to believe that a man's duty is to help those in need, no questions asked. When I found you in that field, you needed help. It's as simple as that. And now, she pressed. Now that you know I've brought trouble to your doorstep. Trouble comes in many forms out here, Ethan said with a shrug. A blizzard, a drought, rustlers, they're all just challenges to overcome. Your husband, he stopped, correcting himself. Blackwell is just another kind of storm passing through. We'll weather it. Eliza studied him for a long moment. You're an unusual man, Ethan Zimmerman. I'll take that as a compliment, he replied with a smile. It was meant as one. She hesitated, then added, I should leave soon. I don't want to bring Blackwell's wrath down on you and Martha. Where would you go? Ethan asked. I have an aunt in California, Eliza said. She never approved of my marriage to Victor. I think she would take me in, help me start over. California's a long way, Ethan observed. And you're still healing, I know, but I can't stay here indefinitely. Why not? The question surprised them both. Eliza blinked, clearly taken aback. I couldn't impose. It's not an imposition, Ethan said carefully. The ranch could use another pair of hands. Martha's been saying for years she needs help with the house, and I know she enjoys your company. Are you offering me a job, Mr. Zimmerman? Eliza asked, a hint of amusement in her voice. I suppose I am, Miss Rose, he replied. At least until you're fully recovered and have decided what you want to do. No obligations, and you can leave any time you choose. The offer hung between them like a fragile thing, full of unspoken possibilities. Ethan realized he was holding his breath, waiting for her answer. I'll consider it, Eliza finally said. Thank you. They lapsed back into silence, but something had shifted between them, a tentative bridge forming across the divide of their very different lives. The next morning, Ethan had to ride into Verdi for supplies. He hesitated before leaving, concerned about leaving Eliza vulnerable if Blackwell somehow tracked her to the ranch. We'll be fine, Martha assured him, shooing him toward the door. I've got the shotgun, and Jake and Will are working the north pasture. They'll keep an eye out. Jake Wilson and Will Cooper were Ethan's most trusted ranch hands, both former soldiers who'd seen enough trouble to recognize it coming. All right, Ethan conceded. I should be back by sundown. Lock the doors after I leave. Verdi was a small but growing town, with a main street lined with the essential businesses: a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a small hotel. Ethan tied his horse outside the general store and spent the next hour gathering supplies. As he was loading his purchases onto his horse, the town sheriff approached. Ethan, Sheriff Tom Miller greeted him with a nod. Haven't seen you in town for a spell. Been busy with the herd, Ethan replied. Getting them ready for the drive to Cheyenne next month, the sheriff nodded. Listen, I've got something you should know about. There's been a man asking questions about a woman, young, dark hair, violet eyes. Says she's his wife and ran off after a disagreement. Ethan's heart sank, but he kept his expression neutral. That's so. Can't say I've seen anyone matching that description. Sheriff Miller studied him for a moment. He's offering a substantial reward for information, $500. A small fortune that would tempt many in these parts. Must want her back something fierce. That's the thing, the sheriff said, lowering his voice. Something don't sit right about him, too smooth if you know what I mean, and the way he talks about her like she's property that wandered off. He shook his head. I told him I hadn't heard of any strangers in town, but I thought you should know, being out there on your own. I appreciate the warning, Tom, Ethan said sincerely. This man have a name, Victor Blackwell out of Cheyenne, says he's got business interests all over the territory. I'll keep an eye out, Ethan promised, feeling a cold knot of anxiety forming in his stomach. When was he in town? Yesterday. Said he'd be back in a few days after checking some other settlements. The sheriff adjusted his hat. Like I said, something about him didn't sit right. You be careful, Ethan. Always am, Ethan replied, mounting his horse. Thanks again, Tom. He rode back to the ranch faster than he'd planned, constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of riders. The knowledge that Blackwell was in the area, actively searching for Eliza, filled him with a sense of urgency he couldn't quite explain to himself. When he arrived back at the ranch, he found Martha and Eliza on the porch, shelling peas and talking quietly. The domestic scene calmed his racing heart somewhat, but the news he brought would shatter this brief peace. You're back early, Martha observed as he dismounted. Everything all right in town? Ethan hesitated, glancing at Eliza. We need to talk. Eliza's face paled as she read his expression. It's Victor, isn't it? He's found me. Not exactly, Ethan said, sitting down beside them, but he was in Verdi yesterday asking questions, offering rewards for information. Martha's hands stilled. Lord above. The sheriff warned me, Ethan continued. Said Blackwell would be back in a few days after checking other settlements nearby. Eliza stood abruptly, peas scattering from her lap. I have to leave now. If he finds me here, she broke off, eyes wide with fear. Eliza, wait, Ethan said, catching her hand. Running now is exactly what he'll expect. Every road, every trail will be watched. Then what do I do? she demanded, her voice rising with panic. "I won't go back to him, Ethan. I'd rather die." "It won't come to that," Ethan said firmly. "I promise you. But we need to think this through carefully." Martha gathered the spilled peas. "Ethan's right, dear. Rushing off half-cocked will only lead you right into his hands. We need a plan." Slowly, Eliza sank back into her chair, her face ashen but resolute. "What kind of plan?" Ethan considered for a moment. Blackwell's looking for a woman traveling alone, desperate and frightened. What if instead he finds nothing unusual at all, just a ranch with its owner, his housekeeper, and his wife? "His wife," Eliza repeated, confused. "A ruse," Ethan explained. "If anyone comes asking, you're Elizabeth Zimmerman, my wife of 2 years. No one in these parts knows me well enough to contradict it. We keep you in plain sight where no one would think to look for a runaway." Martha nodded slowly. "It could work. Most folks around here mind their own business, and those that don't would have no reason to connect Elizabeth Zimmerman to Eliza Rose." "But what about Blackwell?" Eliza asked. "He knows what I look like." "We'll have to make sure you look different enough," Martha mused. "We could cut your hair, maybe dye it with walnut husks to darken it, dress you differently too. And we'll make sure you're never alone," Ethan added. "If Blackwell does come to the ranch, you'll always have one of us nearby." Eliza looked between them, tears welling in her eyes. "Why would you do this? Take such a risk for someone you barely know?" Martha patted her hand. "Because it's the right thing to do, dear. And because no one deserves to live in fear," Ethan added quietly. "Especially not from someone who vowed to love and protect them." A tear slipped down Eliza's cheek. "What if it doesn't work? What if he sees through it?" "Then we'll deal with that when it comes," Ethan said firmly. "But for now, this is our best chance to keep you safe until we can figure out a more permanent solution." That evening, Martha set about transforming Eliza's appearance. Her long, dark hair was cut to just below her shoulders, and walnut husk dye darkened it several shades. They found clothes more suitable for a rancher's wife: practical skirts, simple blouses, and a wide-brimmed hat to shield her face from both sun and scrutiny. When Eliza emerged from her room the next morning, Ethan barely recognized her. The transformation wasn't just physical, she carried herself differently too, her shoulders squared with newfound determination rather than hunched with fear. "Well, Mrs. Zimmerman," he said with a smile, "you look ready to face the day." Eliza returned the smile, though it was tinged with nervousness. "I hope I can play the part convincingly." "Just be yourself," Martha advised, setting a plate of breakfast before her. "The best lies are the ones closest to the truth. You're staying here, recovering from an illness, grateful for your husband's care. That much is true in its way." Over the next few days, they settled into their new roles with surprising ease. Ethan taught Eliza about the ranch operations, the cattle, the crops they grew for feed, the rhythm of ranch life. For her part, Eliza proved a quick study, eager to contribute and genuinely interested in learning. They established a story about their marriage, a whirlwind romance during Ethan's cattle drive to Denver 2 years prior, a small wedding with just the preacher and a few friends as witnesses. Martha helped flesh out the details, creating a history that was simple enough to remember but rich enough to be believable. At night, Ethan moved his belongings into the spare room adjacent to Eliza's to maintain the appearance of a married couple should anyone come calling. He was careful to respect her privacy, always knocking and waiting for permission before entering her room, even as they practiced behaving with the comfortable familiarity of a married couple. It was during these quiet moments, sharing stories on the porch after dinner, teaching Eliza how to ride thunder, working side by side in the kitchen or garden, that Ethan began to realize his concern for her safety had grown into something deeper. He found himself watching her when she wasn't looking, noticing the graceful way she moved, the quiet strength that had survived Blackwell's cruelty, the rare but precious sound of her laughter. One afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after implementing their plan, Ethan was teaching Eliza how to mend a fence in the south pasture when Jake rode up at a gallop. "Riders coming," Jake reported tersely. 3 men, one matching the description of that fella you warned us about. "They're about 10 minutes out," Ethan's heart raced. "Get back to the house," he told Eliza. "Remember what we planned. You're Elizabeth Zimmerman, my wife. You've never been anywhere near Cheyenne. You've been recovering from pneumonia this past month." Eliza nodded, her face pale but determined. "I remember," she hesitated, then impulsively reached up and kissed Ethan's cheek. "Be careful." He watched her ride back toward the house with Jake, then turned his attention to the approaching riders. Through his field glasses, he could make out 3 men on horseback, one in an expensive suit that looked out of place on the trail, flanked by 2 rougher-looking men who were clearly hired guns. Victor Blackwell had arrived. Ethan rode out to meet them, wanting to intercept them before they reached the house. He kept his expression neutral as they approached, nodding a casual greeting. "Afternoon, gentlemen. Something I can help you with." The man in the suit, Blackwell, Ethan presumed studied him with cold, assessing eyes. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, with silver threading through his dark hair and expensive rings on his manicured hands. "Perhaps," Blackwell replied, his voice cultured but with an underlying hardness. "I'm looking for my wife. She's been missing for several weeks, and I have reason to believe she passed through this area." "Sorry to hear that," Ethan said, feigning sympathy. "Can't say I've seen any strangers lately, though. Pretty quiet out this way." "She's quite distinctive," Blackwell pressed. "Small, dark-haired, violet eyes. She may have been injured." Ethan frowned, as if trying to recall. "Nope, doesn't sound familiar. Just me, my wife, and our hands out here for the past month or so." Blackwell's eyes narrowed slightly. "Your wife?" "Yes, sir, going on 2 years now," Ethan replied easily. "Elizabeth's been poorly with pneumonia lately, but she's on the mend." "How fortunate for you," Blackwell said, his tone suggesting he found it anything but. "Would you mind if we stopped by your house for water? It's been a long ride." It was a test, Ethan knew. A way to get a look inside the ranch house and see this wife for himself. "Not at all," Ethan said, turning his horse. "Follow me." As they rode, Ethan silently prayed that Eliza was prepared. They had discussed this possibility, rehearsed it even, but facing Blackwell in the flesh would test her courage like nothing else. Martha was sweeping the porch when they arrived, the picture of a busy housekeeper barely pausing to acknowledge visitors. Ethan dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post. "Martha, these gentlemen need some water. Would you mind fetching some while I see to their horses?" "Of course," Martha replied, disappearing inside. Blackwell and his men dismounted, the 2 guards positioning themselves on either side of their employer, hands never far from their holstered weapons. "Nice place," Blackwell commented, his eyes scanning the property with calculating precision. "Smaller than I expected." "It suits us," Ethan replied. "Still building it up bit by bit." The screen door opened, and Eliza stepped out, dressed in a simple blue calico dress, her darkened hair pulled back in a modest bun. A shawl was draped around her shoulders despite the warm day, a clever touch, Ethan thought, to suggest someone recovering from illness. "Darling, we have guests," Ethan called, mounting the steps to stand beside her. He slipped his arm around her waist in a gesture that felt both protective and surprisingly natural. Eliza smiled up at him, then turned to the visitors. If she recognized Blackwell, nothing in her expression revealed it. "Welcome to our home, gentlemen. I'm Elizabeth Zimmerman." Blackwell stared at her intently, a flicker of something suspicion, recognition, rage crossing his face so quickly that Ethan almost missed it. Then his features smoothed into a practiced smile. "Victor Blackwell," he introduced himself with a slight bow. "These are my associates, Mr. Kane and Mr. Dawson. We appreciate your hospitality." Martha emerged with a tray of water glasses, which she offered to the visitors. Blackwell took his without taking his eyes off Eliza. "Mrs. Zimmerman, you remind me very much of someone I know," he said smoothly. "A relation of mine, in fact, from Cheyenne." "Is that so?" Eliza replied, her voice steady despite the slight tightening of her hand on Ethan's arm. "I've never been to Cheyenne myself. Grew up near Denver, met my husband there during a cattle drive." "How romantic," Blackwell said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "And yet the resemblance is quite remarkable. Wouldn't you agree, Mr. Kane?" The taller of the 2 guards nodded. "Spitting image, boss, except for the hair." Ethan felt Eliza tense beside him. "My wife has been quite ill, Mr. Blackwell," he said firmly. "I'd appreciate it if you wouldn't upset her with these comparisons." "Of course," Blackwell said silkily. "My apologies, Mrs. Zimmerman. It's just that my wife has been missing for some time and I'm quite desperate to find her." "I'm sorry to hear that," Eliza said with perfect composure. "I hope you find her safe and well." "Oh, I intend to," Blackwell replied, his gaze hardening. "She's very precious to me. I'd do anything to bring her home." The threat beneath his words was unmistakable. Ethan's hand moved imperceptibly closer to his holstered revolver. "Well, we won't keep you," he said. "If we hear anything about your wife, we'll be sure to let Sheriff Miller and Verdi know." Blackwell drained his water glass and handed it back to Martha. "Much appreciated, Mr. Zimmerman. You've been most helpful." His eyes lingered on Eliza. "Good day, Mrs. Zimmerman. I hope your health continues to improve." They watched as the three men mounted their horses and rode away, not speaking until the riders were well out of sight. "He knows," Eliza whispered, her legs finally giving way as Ethan helped her to a chair. "He recognized me, I'm sure of it." "Maybe," Ethan acknowledged, kneeling before her. "But he can't be certain, and without proof, there's nothing he can do." "You don't know Victor," Eliza said, her voice shaking. "He doesn't need proof. He'll come back, and next time he won't be so polite." Martha brought Eliza a cup of tea laced with brandy. "Drink this, dear. It'll steady your nerves." Ethan rose and paced the porch, his mind racing. "We need to be prepared. Jake, Will, and I will take turns keeping watch. Martha, you and Eliza stay close to the house." "For how long?" Eliza asked, looking up at him with tear-filled eyes. "I can't live like this forever, Ethan, always looking over my shoulder, putting you all in danger." "Just until we can prove you're free of him," Ethan said, an idea forming. "Martha, wasn't your nephew studying law in Cheyenne, Robert?" "Yes, he's with that big firm there, Johnson and Phillips, I think," Martha replied. "Could you write to him? Ask about the legal standing of a wife who's been abused, whether there's a way to dissolve a marriage in such circumstances." Martha nodded. "I'll write today." "But legal matters take time, Ethan." "Then we'll buy that time," he said firmly, looking at Eliza. "I meant what I said before. My arms are your shelter for as long as you need them to be." The words hung between them, laden with meaning that went beyond their original context. For a moment, something flickered in Eliza's eyes, a warmth, a possibility before she looked away, unable to hold his gaze. "Thank you," she whispered. "All of you. I don't know what I would have done without you." That night, after Martha had retired and the ranch was quiet save for the nocturnal sounds of the prairie, Ethan sat on the porch with his rifle across his lap, keeping the first watch. The door opened behind him and Eliza stepped out, wrapped in a quilt against the evening chill. "You should be resting," Ethan said gently. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, sitting beside him. "Every time I close my eyes, I see his face, hear his voice." She shuddered. "The way he looked at me today, like I was a possession that had been stolen from him." "He's gone now," Ethan reminded her. "And we'll be ready if he comes back." Eliza was quiet for a long moment. "You asked me once why I married him," she finally said. "I never answered you." Ethan waited, sensing she needed to tell this story in her own time. "I was 18, Eliza began, her voice distant with memory. "My father had died the year before, leaving my mother and me with substantial debts. Victor was charming, wealthy, respected. He seemed like salvation." She laughed bitterly. "He was patient at first, courting me properly, winning over my mother with his generosity. We were married within 3 months." She pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders. "The change didn't happen all at once. It was gradual, a criticism here, a restriction there. By the time I realized what was happening, I was isolated from friends and family, dependent on him for everything." "When did he start hurting you?" Ethan asked quietly. "About a year into our marriage," Eliza replied, her voice steady despite the painful subject. "The first time was after a dinner party. I'd spoken too long to one of his business associates. He waited until we were home then." She touched her cheek absently. "Afterward, he was so remorseful, swearing it would never happen again." "But it did," Ethan said, not a question. Eliza nodded. "Each time was worse than the last. Each time there were more promises, more expensive gifts, as if they could erase the bruises." Her voice hardened. 2 months ago, he nearly killed me. That's when I knew I had to leave or die trying. Ethan's hands clenched around his rifle. No man has the right to treat anyone that way, especially not his wife. In the eyes of the law, he has every right, Eliza said tiredly. A wife is property, Ethan. That's what the courts will say. Then the law is wrong, Ethan stated firmly, and we'll find a way around it. Eliza studied him in the moonlight. Why are you doing this? Truly, you barely know me, yet you're risking everything. Ethan considered the question carefully. When I found you in that field, something changed for me, he admitted. I've lived a solitary life since my parents died, focused on building this ranch, not letting myself get too close to anyone. But seeing you there, so vulnerable yet still fighting to survive, it reminded me that there are things worth fighting for beyond just land and cattle. He met her gaze directly. I care what happens to you, Eliza, more than I probably should, given the circumstances. Eliza's breath caught. Tentatively, she reached out and placed her hand over his. I care about you too, Ethan, and it terrifies me. Why? He asked softly. Because the last man I cared for nearly destroyed me, she whispered, and because I don't know if I'll ever be free to care for anyone else. Ethan turned his hand to clasp hers. You will be, he promised. Whatever it takes. They sat in silence after that, hands joined, watching the moon track across the vast Wyoming sky. It wasn't a declaration of love, they were both too cautious, too aware of the obstacles between them for that, but it was an acknowledgement of possibility. A seed planted in difficult soil that might, with care and time, grow into something beautiful. For the next week, the ranch operated under a state of cautious vigilance. Ethan and his hands kept watch in shifts, guns always within reach. Martha's letter to her nephew had been sent, but no reply had yet arrived. Eliza continued to play the role of Elizabeth Zimmerman, even venturing into Verdi with Martha once to reinforce their story, though she kept her face partially hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat and scarf. The ruse seemed to be working. There had been no sign of Blackwell or his men since their visit, and gradually, the tension began to ease. Eliza spent more time outdoors, helping with the garden and learning to ride thunder with growing confidence. In these moments of relative peace, the connection between her and Ethan deepened, expressed in shared glances, brief touches, and conversations that lasted long into the evening. It was during one such evening, as they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, that Martha came hurrying out with a letter in hand. It's from Robert, she exclaimed. Finally. Ethan and Eliza exchanged hopeful glances as Martha broke the seal and unfolded the pages. Her expression grew serious as she read, occasionally mumbling parts of the letter to herself. Well, Ethan prompted when she finally looked up. It's complicated, Martha sighed. Robert says that Wyoming Territory has some of the most progressive laws regarding women's rights, including divorce on grounds of cruelty. But she hesitated, glancing at Eliza. But what? Eliza asked, steeling herself. But she would need to file the petition in court with evidence of the abuse, Martha continued. And during the proceedings, she would still legally be considered her husband's wife under his authority. Meaning Blackwell could legally force her to return to him while the case was pending, Ethan concluded grimly. Martha nodded. Robert mentions one possibility, though. If evidence could be produced that the husband attempted to kill his wife, such as a bullet wound, and if respectable witnesses could attest to this, a judge might grant an immediate injunction preventing the husband from approaching his wife until the divorce is finalized. Hope flared in Eliza's eyes. I have the wound, and Dr. Miller in Verdi treated it. He could testify. And Sheriff Miller heard Blackwell asking about a missing woman with a potential injury, Ethan added. That could corroborate your story, but would it be enough? Eliza wondered. Victor has money, influence. He could claim I was injured by accident or by someone else entirely. Martha scanned the letter again. Robert mentioned something else. Under territorial law, if a woman can prove she was coerced into marriage through fraud or deception, the marriage can be annulled as if it never existed. How would I prove that? Eliza asked, frowning. I don't know, dear, Martha admitted. Robert suggests consulting directly with a judge or lawyer familiar with these matters. Ethan stood, decision made. Then that's what we'll do. Tomorrow we ride to Laramie. There's a circuit judge there who's known for being fair-minded. We'll present our case and see what he advises. Laramie. Eliza repeated, alarmed. That's too close to Cheyenne, too risky. It's also where we're most likely to find legal help, Ethan pointed out. Besides, Blackwell thinks you're here playing the role of my wife. He won't be looking for you in Laramie. Eliza considered this, then nodded slowly. All right, but we should be prepared for the possibility that we might encounter people who know Victor or me. We'll be careful, Ethan promised, and we won't stay any longer than necessary. The next morning, they set out before dawn, with Martha staying behind to maintain the appearance of normalcy at the ranch. Eliza rode Thunder, having bonded with the once wild stallion over the past weeks. They traveled cross-country rather than using the main roads, adding time to their journey but reducing the risk of encountering Blackwell or his men. As they rode, Eliza shared more about her life before Blackwell growing up as the daughter of a bank manager in Denver. Her dreams of becoming a teacher thwarted first by her father's death and then by her marriage. Ethan, in turn, told her about building the ranch from nothing after his parents died in a cholera outbreak, the loneliness of the endeavor, and his determination to create something lasting. I used to look at this land and see only what it could produce, he admitted as they stopped to rest the horses near a small creek. Cattle, crops, profit. It was all about building something that would outlast me, I suppose. And now, Eliza asked, sitting beside him on a fallen log. Ethan looked at her, at the way the sunlight caught in her hair and the quiet strength in her violet eyes. Now I'm starting to think maybe there are other ways to leave something behind in this world. A blush colored Eliza's cheeks, but she didn't look away. When I ran from Victor, all I thought about was escape, survival I never expected to find. She hesitated. To find a place where I might belong. You do belong, Ethan said softly. Whatever happens in Laramie, whatever comes after you have a place at the Lazy Z for as long as you want it. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Then Eliza leaned forward and brushed her lips against his cheek, a gesture both innocent and profoundly intimate. Thank you, she whispered, her breath warm against his skin. They reached Laramie by late afternoon, the town bustling with activity as the workday came to a close. Ethan had been to Laramie several times for cattle auctions and recognized enough landmarks to navigate to the small hotel near the courthouse where they planned to stay the night. We should keep up the pretense of being married, Ethan suggested as they approached the hotel. Just in case Blackwell has contacts here, Eliza nodded, adjusting her hat to better shade her face. Agreed. The hotel clerk barely glanced at them as Ethan signed the register as Mr. and Mrs. Ethan Zimmerman and paid for a single room. As they climbed the stairs, Ethan assured Eliza, I'll sleep on the floor, you take the bed. Their room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window overlooking the main street. Ethan secured the door while Eliza peered cautiously through the curtains at the town below. The courthouse is just across the street, he said, joining her at the window. First thing tomorrow, we'll try to see Judge Harrison. Martha's nephew mentioned him as being sympathetic to cases like yours. Eliza nodded, then turned to Ethan with troubled eyes. What if this doesn't work, Ethan? What if there's no legal way for me to be free of Victor? Then we'll find another way, he said firmly, even if it means leaving the territory altogether. You would do that, she asked, surprised. Leave your ranch, everything you've built. A ranch is just land and buildings, Ethan replied. It can be rebuilt elsewhere if necessary. He took her hands in his. Eliza, a knock at the door interrupted him. They both froze, exchanging alarmed glances. Mr. Zimmerman, a voice called. Message for you, sir. Ethan motioned for Eliza to stay back, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip as he approached the door. Who's it from? He called. Sheriff's office, sir. Cautiously, Ethan opened the door a crack to find a young boy in a worn cap holding an envelope. Sheriff Jenkins asked me to deliver this to you soon as you arrived, sir. Said it was urgent. Ethan accepted the envelope and gave the boy a coin. "How did the sheriff know I was here?" The boy shrugged. "Don't know, sir. I just deliver the messages." He tipped his cap and scurried off down the hall. Ethan closed and locked the door before opening the envelope. Inside was a brief note written in a hasty scrawl. "Mr. Zimmerman, I received a telegram from Sheriff Miller in Verde this morning. Blackwell's men were seen searching your ranch. No injuries reported, but Miller thought you should know. Come to my office as soon as you receive this." Sheriff Jenkins. Ethan handed the note to Eliza, whose face paled as she read it. "Martha," she gasped. "Jake and Will, they could be in danger because of me." "Sheriff Miller would have mentioned if anyone was hurt," Ethan reassured her, though his own worry was evident. "We need to see Sheriff Jenkins right away." They hurried across town to the sheriff's office, where Jenkins, a grizzled man with a silver mustache and shrewd eyes, was waiting for them. "Figured that message would smoke you out," he said, gesturing for them to sit. "Miller sent the telegram this morning, said you might be headed this way and to keep an eye out for you." "What exactly happened at my ranch?" Ethan asked urgently. "According to Miller, Blackwell and 4 men rode up yesterday demanding to search the place. Your housekeeper refused, said they had no right. They forced their way in anyway." Jenkins stroked his mustache. "Your ranch hands tried to intervene, but they were outnumbered. No one was seriously hurt, though one of your men took a beating." "And Martha?" Eliza asked, her voice tight with fear. "The housekeeper, she's fine. Apparently she took a shotgun to one of Blackwell's men when he got too rough with your hand, grazed his arm." A hint of admiration colored the sheriff's voice. "Tough old bird," by the sound of it. Relief washed over both Ethan and Eliza, followed quickly by renewed concern. "We need to get back," Ethan said, rising. Sheriff Jenkins held up a hand. "Not so fast. Miller also said Blackwell's put men on the roads between here and Verde. He knows you're in Laramie." "How?" Eliza whispered. "Someone in Verde must have talked," Ethan concluded grimly. $500 is a lot of money. "That and Blackwell's apparently claiming his wife has been kidnapped by a rancher named Zimmerman," Jenkins added, his gaze shifting to Eliza. "Which brings me to the question of who exactly you might be, madam." Eliza and Ethan exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them before Ethan nodded slightly. "My name is Eliza Rose," she said, straightening her shoulders. "Victor Blackwell is my husband, but I fled from him after years of abuse. The last time he shot me and left me for dead in a field near Ethan's ranch." She touched her side where the wound had healed into a puckered scar. "Ethan found me and gave me shelter. He's been protecting me ever since." Jenkins studied her for a long moment. "That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Blackwell. It's the truth," she replied steadily. "And I have the scars to prove it." The sheriff's weathered face softened slightly. "I believe you, madam. I've seen enough of Blackwell in the past day to know he's not a man who takes kindly to being denied what he considers his property." He turned to Ethan. "But that puts you both in a difficult position legally. He's her husband under the law with rights over her person and property." "That's why we came to Laramie," Ethan explained, "to seek legal counsel from Judge Harrison about obtaining a divorce or annulment." Jenkins nodded thoughtfully. "Harrison's a good man, fair-minded, especially when it comes to women in difficult circumstances, but Blackwell's claiming kidnapping, which complicates things." "I went willingly," Eliza insisted. "Ethan saved my life." "I don't doubt that," Jenkins said. "But Blackwell has money and influence. He's already telegraphed the territorial governor demanding action." He sighed heavily. "I can buy you some time, a day, maybe 2, while I investigate these kidnapping claims. That should give you a chance to speak with Harrison." "Thank you, Sheriff," Ethan said sincerely. "Don't thank me yet," Jenkins replied grimly. "You're both taking a mighty big risk. If Harrison can't help you, I might have no choice but to return Mrs. Blackwell to her husband." "That won't happen," Ethan stated, his voice hard with determination. Jenkins raised an eyebrow. "Planning to break the law, Zimmerman, planning to uphold a higher one," Ethan replied evenly. "No one deserves to be treated the way Blackwell treated Eliza, not ever." The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Judge Harrison usually holds court in the morning. Be at the courthouse by 8. I'll make sure he knows you're coming." He stood, signaling the end of their meeting. "In the meantime, stay out of sight. Blackwell hasn't arrived in Laramie yet, but his telegrams suggest he's on his way." They returned to their hotel room, both subdued by the news from the ranch and the precariousness of their situation. Ethan paced by the window, watching the street below for any sign of trouble, while Eliza sat on the edge of the bed, lost in thought. "I should never have involved you in this," she finally said. "Martha, Jake, well, they could have been killed because of me." "They chose to help," Ethan reminded her, "just as I did. None of us regrets that choice. But if something happened to you because of me, I couldn't." Her voice broke. "I couldn't bear it, Ethan." He crossed the room to sit beside her, taking her hands in his. "Nothing's going to happen to me, or to you. We're going to see Judge Harrison tomorrow, and we're going to find a legal way out of this mess." "And if we don't?" Eliza asked quietly. "Then we leave," Ethan said simply. "Tonight, if necessary, head west to Idaho Territory or north to Montana, somewhere Blackwell can't reach us." Eliza searched his face. "You would give up everything, your ranch, your life here for me?" "Yes," Ethan replied without hesitation. "Because none of it means anything without you in it." The admission hung in the air between them, more direct than anything they'd expressed before. Eliza's breath caught, and for a moment, she simply stared at him, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The sound of horses and men's voices from the street below interrupted her. Ethan rose quickly and moved to the window, peering cautiously through the curtains. "Blackwell?" Eliza asked, tensing. Ethan shook his head. "No, just the evening stage arriving." He turned back to her. "But he could be here by morning. We should try to rest while we can." They prepared for bed awkwardly, the small room offering little privacy. True to his word, Ethan made a pallet on the floor with spare blankets, while Eliza took the bed. They extinguished the lamp, plunging the room into darkness save for the silver of moonlight filtering through the curtains. For a long time, neither slept, each acutely aware of the other's presence just feet away. "Ethan," Eliza's voice drifted through the darkness. "Yes, what you said before, about nothing meaning anything without me in it." She paused. "Did you mean it?" Ethan shifted to face the bed, though he could barely make out her silhouette in the dim light. Every word. Silence stretched between them, pregnant with possibility. "I think I'm falling in love with you," Eliza confessed, so softly he almost didn't hear it, "and it terrifies me." Ethan sat up, his heart pounding. "Why does it terrify you?" "Because I thought I loved Victor once, and I was so wrong," she replied. "Because I'm still legally his wife, because I'm afraid of bringing destruction down on you and everyone you care about." Ethan rose and moved to sit on the edge of the bed, finding her hand in the darkness. "What I feel for you isn't anything like what you had with Blackwell," he said gently. "It's not about possession or control. It's about wanting you to be safe and happy and free, even if that means without me." Eliza's fingers tightened around his. "But I don't want to be without you," she whispered. "That's what scares me most of all." In the silvery half-light, Ethan could just make out the gleam of tears on her cheeks. Gently, he brushed them away with his fingertips. "Then we fight," he said simply. "Together, for as long as it takes." Eliza reached up, her hand finding his cheek in the darkness. Then, with a courage born of desperation and hope, she drew his face down to hers and kissed him. It was a gentle kiss at first, tentative and questioning. Then, as Ethan responded, it deepened into something more profound, an affirmation, a promise, a declaration that needed no words. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. "Stay," Eliza whispered, moving over to make room for him on the narrow bed. "Just hold me tonight." Ethan hesitated only a moment before stretching out beside her, drawing her into the circle of his arms. They lay together fully clothed, her head resting on his chest, his hand stroking her hair, finding comfort in each other's presence as the night deepened around them. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Ethan murmured against her hair, "remember that my arms are your shelter. Always." Eliza's response was to nestle closer, her arm tightening around his waist as she finally surrendered to exhaustion, safe in the knowledge that she was no longer alone in her fight. They woke before dawn, their bodies still entwined on the narrow hotel bed. For a moment, neither moved, reluctant to break the spell of safety they'd found in each other's arms. Then reality intruded the knowledge that this day might determine the course of their future, together or apart. They prepared in silence, the intimate confessions of the night before creating a new awareness between them, a tenderness in their glances, a lingering touch as they passed each other in the small room. By the time the courthouse clock struck 7, they were ready, both physically and emotionally, for whatever lay ahead. The town was just coming to life as they made their way across the street to the imposing brick courthouse. Sheriff Jenkins met them on the steps, his expression guarded. "Judge Harrison will see you in his chambers before court begins," he informed them. "I've explained the basics of your situation, but you'll need to convince him yourselves." He hesitated, then added, "Blackwell arrived on the early stage. He's meeting with his lawyers at the hotel now." Eliza paled but squared her shoulders. "Then we have no time to waste." Judge Franklin Harrison was not what Eliza had expected. Rather than the stern, authoritative figure she'd imagined, he was a slight man with kind eyes and a scholarly demeanor, more resembling a professor than a jurist. He listened attentively as Eliza recounted her marriage to Blackwell, the years of escalating abuse, and her desperate flight after being shot. "May I see the wound?" he asked gently. Eliza hesitated, then nodded, turning slightly and lifting the side of her jacket and blouse just enough to reveal the puckered scar beneath. The judge examined it with a clinical eye. "And you are certain it was your husband who shot you?" "Yes, Your Honor," Eliza replied firmly. "He said if he couldn't have me, no one would." Harrison nodded gravely, then turned to Ethan. "And you found her after this occurred?" "Yes, sir," Ethan confirmed. "In a field about 15 miles west of my ranch. She was unconscious, bleeding. I took her home and my housekeeper tended to her." "And at what point did you develop romantic feelings for Mrs. Blackwell?" the judge asked bluntly. Ethan blinked, taken aback by the direct question. I'm not sure exactly. It happened gradually as I got to know her." "And yet you pretended she was your wife to protect her from Blackwell," Harrison observed. "A noble lie, perhaps, but a lie nonetheless." "We had no other choice," Ethan defended. "Blackwell was searching for her, offering rewards. He would have forced her to return to him." The judge steepled his fingers, considering. "Mrs. Blackwell, under territorial law, I have the authority to grant a divorce on grounds of extreme cruelty. Your account, if proven, would certainly qualify." He held up a hand to forestall their relief. "However, the process requires filing a formal petition, providing evidence and potentially a trial. During that time, legally, you would remain Mr. Blackwell's wife. And he could force me to return to him," Eliza concluded, her heart sinking. "Potentially, yes," Harrison admitted. "Though I could issue an injunction preventing him from approaching you if I believed your life was in danger." He paused. "There is another possibility, though it's less common, an annulment on grounds of fraud or coercion." "How would that work?" Ethan asked. "If Mrs. Blackwell can prove she was induced to marry under false pretenses, that Mr. Blackwell misrepresented himself in a material way, the marriage could be declared void from its inception." The judge looked at Eliza. "Did your husband conceal anything significant from you before the marriage?" "A previous wife, perhaps, criminal activities, a violent nature," Eliza frowned, thinking back. "He presented himself as respectable, kind, generous. The violence didn't start until after we were married." "What about his business dealings?" Harrison pressed. "Did you know the source of his wealth?" "He said it came from investments, mining interests," Eliza replied. "I never questioned it." The judge looked thoughtful. "Mrs. Blackwell, in cases like these, the court must balance competing interests, a wife's right to safety against a husband's legal rights. If you were to present evidence that your husband's wealth came from criminal enterprises, it could strengthen your case for annulment on grounds of fraud." Ethan leaned forward. "Judge Harrison, what kind of evidence would be required?" "Business records, testimony from associates, anything showing illegal activities," Harrison replied. "But gathering such evidence would be difficult and potentially dangerous." A knock at the door interrupted them. The judge's clerk entered with an urgent expression. Your Honor, Mr. Victor Blackwell is demanding to see you immediately. He claims his wife has been kidnapped and is being held against her will. Harrison's expression hardened. Tell Mr. Blackwell I am in a private meeting and will see him when court convenes at 9 o'clock. After the clerk left, he turned back to Eliza and Ethan. Our time is limited. Mrs. Blackwell, do you have any reason to believe your husband's business dealings might not be legitimate? Eliza hesitated. There was something. About a year ago, I overheard an argument between Victor and one of his partners. They mentioned doctored mining reports and defrauded investors. When I asked Victor about it later, he became enraged, said I was never to speak of his business matters. The judge's eyes sharpened. That could be significant. Mining fraud is a serious offense in the territory. He made a note on the paper before him. Mr. Zimmerman, Sheriff Jenkins mentioned you have business connections in Cheyenne. A few, Ethan confirmed. I sell cattle to several establishments there. Would any of those connections have information about Blackwell's mining interests? Ethan thought for a moment. Thomas Wainwright at the First Bank of Cheyenne. He handles most of the major mining investments in the region. If there's been fraud, he might know of it. Harrison nodded decisively. Here's what I propose. I will issue a temporary injunction preventing Mr. Blackwell from approaching or removing Mrs. Blackwell for the next 7 days on grounds that her safety may be at risk. During that time, Mr. Zimmerman, you will attempt to gather evidence regarding these potentially fraudulent mining operations. And if we find such evidence, Eliza asked hopefully, then I would have grounds to grant an annulment rather than a divorce, Harrison explained. The marriage would be declared void ab initio from the beginning as if it never existed. Hope flared in Eliza's chest. And I would be free of him completely? Legally, yes, the judge confirmed, though I cannot guarantee your physical safety. Blackwell seems determined to reclaim you regardless of the law. We'll handle that, Ethan said firmly. Thank you, Your Honor. Harrison penned the injunction quickly, signing it with a flourish. This will be served on Mr. Blackwell when court convenes. In the meantime, I suggest you both leave Laramie as discreetly as possible. Sheriff Jenkins can assist you. As they rose to leave, the judge added, Mrs. Blackwell, I admire your courage. Not many women would have the strength to take the steps you have. Eliza smiled faintly. I had help, Your Honor. Good help. They found Sheriff Jenkins waiting outside the judge's chambers. After a brief explanation of Harrison's decision, the sheriff led them through a side door of the courthouse to an alley where 2 horses were waiting. These belong to my deputy, Jenkins explained. He'll collect them later from the livery in Verde. There's a trail that runs behind the town, follows Medicine Bow River for a ways before cutting north toward Verde. Not many know it, but it'll keep you off the main roads where Blackwell might have men watching. We need to get to Cheyenne, Ethan said. Judge Harrison's given us 7 days to find evidence of mining fraud in Blackwell's operations. Jenkins whistled low. That's a tall order. And risky Cheyenne's Blackwell's territory. It's our best chance to secure Eliza's freedom permanently, Ethan replied. The sheriff nodded reluctantly. Then you'll need to swing south after crossing the river, but be careful, Blackwell has eyes everywhere in Cheyenne. They mounted quickly, Eliza now comfortably handling her horse after weeks of practice at the ranch. As they prepared to ride out, Jenkins handed Ethan a folded paper. The injunction, he explained. Keep it with you. It's legal protection for what that's worth against a man like Blackwell. Thank you, Sheriff, Eliza said sincerely. For everything, Jenkins tipped his hat. Good luck to you both. You're going to need it. They rode hard through the morning, following the sheriff's directions along the less traveled trail that wound through stands of pine and aspen before reaching the Medicine Bow River. As they watered the horses, Ethan studied the map Jenkins had provided. If we follow this route, we should reach Cheyenne by tomorrow afternoon, he said, tracing the path with his finger. We'll need to be careful entering the city. Blackwell will have people watching the main roads. Eliza nodded, her face set with determination. Do you think your banking friend will help us? Thomas isn't exactly a friend, Ethan admitted. More of a business acquaintance, but he's honest, and if there's been fraud in Blackwell's mining operations, he'll want it exposed. They continued south, making good time until dusk began to fall. Finding a sheltered spot near a small creek, they made camp for the night, keeping the fire small to avoid attracting attention. As they shared a simple meal of jerky and hardtack from their saddlebags, Eliza grew pensive. "What are you thinking?" Ethan asked, noticing her distant expression. "About everything that's happened," she replied softly. "A month ago, I was trapped in a nightmare with no way out. Now I'm here with you, fighting for a future I never dared imagine." She looked up at him. "It doesn't seem real sometimes." "It's real," Ethan assured her, reaching across to take her hand. "What we're doing, what we're feeling, it's the most real thing I've ever known." Eliza's fingers tightened around his. "If we succeed, if Judge Harrison grants the annulment, what happens next? Ethan, what do you want to happen?" He asked, his voice gentle. "I want to be free," she said immediately. "Free to make my own choices, live my own life." She hesitated. "And I want you to be part of that life, if you still want to be." Ethan moved to sit beside her, drawing her close. "I want that more than anything," he murmured. "But I need you to be sure, Eliza. After what you've been through with Blackwell, I'd understand if you needed time, space." "I've had enough of being alone," Eliza replied, resting her head against his shoulder. "What I need is to feel safe, valued, loved." She looked up at him. "The way I feel with you." Under the vast Wyoming sky, with stars beginning to prick the deepening twilight, they sealed their understanding with a kiss that held all the promise of the future they hoped to build together once they overcame the final obstacle standing in their way. They reached Cheyenne the following afternoon, approaching the city from the west to avoid the main thoroughfares. The territorial capital was significantly larger than Verde or Laramie, with multi-story buildings lining the streets and a constant bustle of activity that made Eliza nervous after weeks in the relative isolation of the Lazy Z Ranch. "We'll need a place to stay," Ethan said as they rode slowly through the outskirts of town. "Somewhere out of the way where Blackwell's people are less likely to look." "What about there?" Eliza suggested, pointing to a modest boarding house set back from the street, its simple sign reading Mrs. Wilson's Lodging. They secured a room under the names John and Mary Smith, explaining to the motherly proprietor that they were passing through on their way to visit family in Denver. Mrs. Wilson accepted their story without question, showing them to a clean, sparsely furnished room on the second floor. "I'll go find Thomas Wainwright," Ethan said once they were alone. "You should stay here, keep out of sight." "Be careful," Eliza urged, anxiety tightening her voice. "If Victor is back from Laramie already, he'll have people watching for us." Ethan cupped her face gently. "I'll be back before dark. Lock the door behind me and don't open it for anyone but me." First National Bank of Cheyenne was an imposing structure of red brick and polished wood, reflecting the prosperity that railroads and cattle had brought to the territorial capital. Ethan felt distinctly out of place in his trail-worn clothes as he approached the teller's window. "I need to see Mr. Thomas Wainwright," he stated, trying to project more confidence than he felt. The young teller looked him up and down dubiously. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but he'll want to see me," Ethan replied. "Tell him Ethan Zimmerman is here about a matter concerning Victor Blackwell." The teller's eyes widened slightly at the mention of Blackwell's name. "Wait here, please." To Ethan's relief, Thomas Wainwright appeared moments later, a tall, spare man with spectacles and a thoughtful demeanor. "Zimmerman," he greeted him with a handshake. "This is unexpected. Come to my office, please." Once the door was closed behind them, Wainwright's professional demeanor shifted to one of cautious concern. "You mentioned Blackwell. That's not a name to be thrown around lightly in this town." "I know," Ethan acknowledged, "but I need information about him, specifically about his mining operations." Wainwright's expression grew guarded. "What kind of information?" "Evidence of fraud," Ethan stated bluntly. "Doctored mining reports, defrauded investors, anything that would show Blackwell was conducting illegal business." The banker removed his spectacles, polishing them methodically as he considered Ethan's request. "That's a serious accusation, Zimmerman." Blackwell is a powerful man with friends in high places. I know that too, Ethan replied, but someone's life depends on this information. Wainwright replaced his spectacles, studying Ethan with newfound intensity. Would this someone be Blackwell's missing wife by any chance? The one he's offering a substantial reward to find. Ethan hesitated, then decided on honesty. Yes, she fled from him after years of abuse. He shot her, left her for dead. I found her, helped her recover. Now we're trying to secure an annulment of the marriage on grounds of fraud. And you need evidence that Blackwell misrepresented himself before the marriage, Wainwright concluded. Specifically that his wealth came from criminal activities. Exactly. The banker was quiet for a long moment, then rose and moved to a large safe in the corner of his office. After working the combination, he extracted a folder bound with string. For the past year, I've been conducting an internal investigation into certain mining investments handled by this bank, he explained, returning to his desk. Several promising claims suddenly went bust after significant investment, with the original promoters mysteriously selling their shares just before the collapse. He opened the folder, revealing sheets of financial records, correspondence, and mining surveys. 3 of these operations were backed by Blackwell Mining Consortium, a company owned primarily by Victor Blackwell. In each case, the initial surveys were glowing, investors poured in money, and then the mines failed to produce. Coincidence, Ethan suggested, playing devil's advocate. Perhaps, except for this, Wainwright replied, extracting a letter. A confession from a surveyor named Jenkins who admitted to falsifying reports in exchange for payment from Blackwell's company. He sent it to me after fleeing to Denver, apparently troubled by his conscience. Ethan's pulse quickened. May I see it? The letter was detailed, describing how Blackwell had personally instructed the surveyor to exaggerate findings with specific dates and amounts of money changing hands. Most damning of all, it was dated 6 months before Blackwell's marriage to Eliza. This proves he was engaged in fraud before he married Eliza, Ethan said, excitement building. Would you be willing to testify to this in court, or provide copies of these documents? Wainwright hesitated. Going against Blackwell publicly could be professional suicide, Zimmerman. Possibly literal suicide. I understand, Ethan said, disappointment washing over him, but these records could free an innocent woman from a monster. The banker studied him for a long moment. You care for her deeply, don't you? Yes, Ethan admitted simply. I love her. Wainwright sighed, then began to make copies of the most damning documents. I can't testify in person, but I'll provide these copies and a sworn affidavit. Judge Harrison is known to me as an honorable man. He'll understand the risk I'm taking. Relief flooded through Ethan. Thank you. This could make all the difference. As Wainwright finished preparing the documents, a commotion arose from the bank lobby. Raised voices, the sound of heavy footsteps approaching. Blackwell, Wainwright hissed, quickly bundling the copies into a leather portfolio. He must have been alerted to your presence. There's a back door through my secretary's office. Go now. Ethan grabbed the portfolio and hurried through the indicated door just as the main door to Wainwright's office burst open. Through the crack, he caught a glimpse of Victor Blackwell, a handsome man with cold eyes and an air of absolute authority striding into the room. Wainwright, I understand Ethan Zimmerman was just here. Where is he? Blackwell's voice was cultured but hard as steel. Mr. Zimmerman left some time ago, Wainwright replied calmly. Banking business, confidential, I'm afraid. Don't play games with me, Thomas, Blackwell warned. That man has kidnapped my wife. Aiding him makes you an accessory. Ethan didn't wait to hear more. Slipping through the secretary's office, he exited onto a side street and made his way quickly through the back alleys of Cheyenne. The precious portfolio clutched tightly under his arm. By the time he reached Mrs. Wilson's boarding house, dusk was falling. He took extra care to ensure he wasn't followed before slipping inside and hurrying upstairs to their room. Eliza opened the door at his specific knock, relief washing over her face at the sight of him. Thank God, she breathed, pulling him inside and locking the door behind him. I was so worried. For good reason, Ethan replied grimly, setting the portfolio on the small table. Blackwell showed up at the bank while I was there. We need to leave Cheyenne tonight. Did you get what we needed? Eliza asked anxiously. Ethan opened the portfolio, showing her the documents. Wainwright came through. These prove Blackwell was running mining scams before you married him. He misrepresented the source of his wealth, which constitutes fraud. Hope brightened Eliza's eyes as she scanned the papers. This could actually work, she whispered. We could be free. We need to get these to Judge Harrison immediately, Ethan said. But Blackwell knows I was at the bank. He'll have men watching the roads north to Laramie. Then we go east first, Eliza suggested. Circle around and approach Laramie from the north. It will take longer, but we'll avoid the main roads where they'll be watching. Ethan nodded, impressed by her tactical thinking. We'll leave in an hour after full dark. As they gathered their few belongings and prepared to depart, a soft knock came at their door. They froze, exchanging alarmed glances. The knock came again, followed by Mrs. Wilson's voice. Mr. and Mrs. Smith, there's a message for you. Ethan motioned for Eliza to stay back as he cautiously opened the door. Mrs. Wilson stood there, her kindly face creased with concern as she handed him a folded note. A boy delivered this just now, she explained. Said it was urgent. Thank you, Ethan said, waiting until she had retreated down the hall before closing the door and unfolding the note. Z. Blackwell knows where you are. Men on their way to boarding house now. Use service exit behind kitchen. Horse waiting in alley. W. We have to go, Ethan said urgently, stuffing the documents into his saddlebag. Now. They slipped downstairs, finding the kitchen deserted as the evening meal had already concluded. The service door led to a narrow alley behind the boarding house, where, as promised, a horse was tethered a sturdy bay gelding with a note tucked into the saddle. Good luck. With Eliza mounted behind him on the fresh horse, Ethan urged the animal into a canter, weaving through the back streets of Cheyenne until they reached the eastern outskirts of town. Just as they were about to break into open country, hoofbeats sounded behind them, 3 riders in pursuit, closing fast. Hold on, Ethan shouted, spurring the horse to a full gallop. They raced east across the darkening prairie, the sound of pursuit never far behind. The bay was strong but carrying double weight, and Ethan knew they couldn't outrun their pursuers indefinitely. They needed cover, somewhere to hide until they could lose their trackers. A stand of cottonwoods along a creek bed appeared to their right, and Ethan veered toward it, hoping the darkness and trees would provide enough cover to confuse their pursuers. As they plunged into the shallow water, riding along the creek bed to hide their tracks, a shot rang out behind them. Eliza cried out, and Ethan felt her grip on his waist loosen. Eliza, he called in alarm, reaching back to steady her. I'm all right, she gasped. It just grazed my arm, but he could feel the warmth of her blood seeping through his shirt where she pressed against him. Anger and fear propelled him forward, deeper into the trees until the creek widened into a small, secluded pool. There, he finally reined in, helping Eliza dismount before examining her wound. The bullet had indeed only grazed her upper arm, but it was bleeding freely. Tearing a strip from his shirt, Ethan bound it quickly, his ears straining for sounds of pursuit. We can't stay here long, he whispered. They'll search the creek. Eliza nodded, her face pale but determined in the moonlight filtering through the trees. I can ride. The documents are what matter now. They remained hidden for nearly an hour, until the sounds of their pursuers faded as the search moved in the wrong direction. Then, cautiously, they emerged from the shelter of the cottonwoods and continued east, riding more slowly now to spare the horse and avoid making noise that might attract attention. By dawn, they had covered enough ground to risk stopping at a small farmhouse, where a sympathetic widow provided food, fresh bandages for Eliza's arm, and directions to a seldom-used trail that would take them north toward Laramie while avoiding the main roads. We should reach Laramie by tomorrow night if we push hard, Ethan calculated as they rode away from the farmhouse. Judge Harrison's injunction gives us until the day after tomorrow. Will we make it? Eliza asked, her voice tight with pain and exhaustion. Ethan reached back to squeeze her hand where it rested at his waist. We will. We've come too far to fail now. The journey north was arduous, made more difficult by Eliza's injury and the constant vigilance required to avoid Blackwell's men. They traveled mostly at night, resting during daylight hours in hidden locations away from roads and settlements. Twice, they spotted riders in the distance that might have been searching for them, but each time they managed to remain concealed until the danger passed. By the time they reached the outskirts of Laramie, both were exhausted, hungry, and filthy from 2 days of hard travel. But the precious documents were safe, and with them, the key to Eliza's freedom. Rather than risk being seen in town, they approached the courthouse from the rear, where Sheriff Jenkins had told them the judge's private entrance was located. It was early evening, after most of the day's court business would have concluded, but light still shone from the window of Harrison's chambers. "Wait here with the horse," Ethan instructed, helping Eliza dismount in the shadow of a large oak tree. "I'll make sure it's safe." He approached the private entrance cautiously, knocking softly on the door. After a tense moment, it opened to reveal Judge Harrison himself, eyebrows raised in surprise. "Zimmerman, I didn't expect to see you back so soon and in this condition." He stepped aside, gesturing for Ethan to enter. "Where is Mrs. Blackwell?" "Outside," Ethan replied, keeping his voice low. "We had to be careful. Blackwell's men have been pursuing us since Cheyenne." Harrison's expression grew grave. "You found evidence then?" "Yes, sir." Ethan extracted the portfolio from his saddlebag, presenting it to the judge. Banking records, correspondence, and a sworn affidavit from Thomas Wainwright of First National Bank of Cheyenne. They prove Blackwell was engaged in mining fraud before his marriage to Eliza. While the judge examined the documents, Ethan retrieved Eliza from her hiding place, guiding her into the private chambers. She was pale with exhaustion, her wounded arm held carefully against her body, but her eyes were clear and determined as she faced Judge Harrison. "Mrs. Blackwell," the judge greeted her with a respectful nod. "I see you've endured quite an ordeal to secure these documents." "A small price for freedom, Your Honor," Eliza replied steadily. Harrison gestured for them both to sit as he continued reviewing the evidence. After several minutes of careful examination, he looked up, his expression thoughtful. "This is compelling evidence of fraud," he acknowledged, "combined with Mrs. Blackwell's testimony about overhearing discussions of doctored mining reports. It establishes that Mr. Blackwell misrepresented the source of his wealth prior to the marriage." Hope surged in Ethan's chest. "Is it enough for an annulment?" "Under normal circumstances, I would say yes," Harrison replied cautiously. "However, these are not normal circumstances. Blackwell has filed formal kidnapping charges against you, Mr. Zimmerman. He's also petitioned to have my injunction overturned on grounds that his wife is being held against her will." Eliza leaned forward earnestly. "Your Honor, I left Victor of my own free will after he shot me and left me for dead. Ethan saved my life. Everything I've done since then has been my choice." "I believe you, Mrs. Blackwell," Harrison assured her, "but the law requires more than belief, it requires proof process." He tapped the documents before him. "These provide grounds for an annulment, but the matter must still be properly adjudicated." "How long will that take?" Ethan asked, anxiety creeping into his voice. "Ordinarily, weeks or months," Harrison admitted. "But given the unusual circumstances, the evidence of both fraud and physical danger, I could hold a special hearing as early as tomorrow morning." "Blackwell will be there," Eliza said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He'll try to force me to return with him." "Not while my injunction stands," Harrison reminded her, "and after reviewing this evidence, I'm inclined to maintain that protection." He stood, decision made. "The hearing will be at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning in my private chambers, not the open courtroom. Sheriff Jenkins will ensure your safety." As they prepared to leave through the private entrance, the judge added, "I've arranged a room for you at my sister's boarding house on Pine Street. She'll be discreet, and her house is the last place Blackwell would look for you." "Thank you, Your Honor," Ethan said sincerely. "Don't thank me yet," Harrison cautioned. "Tomorrow will not be easy. Blackwell will fight this with everything he has." So will we, Eliza replied with quiet determination, the judge's sister, a widow named Mrs. Eleanor Parker, welcomed them to her modest boarding house with no questions asked beyond what they might like for supper. After days on the trail, the simple meal of beef stew and fresh bread seemed like a feast, and the promise of clean beds nearly brought tears to Eliza's exhausted eyes. Mrs. Parker insisted on properly cleaning and bandaging Eliza's wounded arm before showing them to a comfortable room at the rear of the house, away from the street. Unlike at the hotel in Laramie, this time there was no awkwardness as they prepared for bed together. They had been through too much, shared too many dangers and confidences for such hesitations to remain between them. They lay together in the darkness, Ethan's arms around Eliza as they had been that night in Laramie, though now the embrace held both protection and promise of what would be, once the final barrier to their future was removed. "Are you afraid?" Ethan asked softly, his breath warm against her hair. "Yes," Eliza admitted, "but not like before. Now it's the fear of hope, of wanting something so badly that losing it would be unbearable." Ethan tightened his arms around her. "We won't lose. The evidence is strong and Harrison is fair. By this time tomorrow you'll be free, and then," she asked, tilting her head to see his face in the moonlight filtering through the curtains. "And then," Ethan said, brushing his lips against her forehead, "we go home. To the Lazy Z, to our life together, if that's what you want." "It's what I want," Eliza whispered, reaching up to touch his cheek. "More than anything." In that moment, with freedom so close they could almost grasp it, they allowed themselves to believe in the future they had fought so hard to secure, a future built on trust, respect, and love, far from the shadows of Eliza's past. The morning of the hearing dawned clear and bright, the late summer air crisp with the first hint of approaching autumn. Sheriff Jenkins arrived at Mrs. Parker's boarding house shortly after breakfast to escort them to the courthouse, his deputies positioned strategically along the route. "Blackwell's in town," Jenkins informed them as they walked. "Arrived last night with his lawyer and those 2 gunmen who always shadow him. He knows about the hearing but not where you're staying. Will he try something at the courthouse?" Ethan asked, his hand never far from his holstered revolver. "Not inside," Jenkins replied confidently. "Too many witnesses, including Judge Harrison himself, but afterward," he shrugged. "Hard to say, man like that, used to getting his way, might not take losing very well." They entered the courthouse through the same private entrance they had used the previous evening, finding Judge Harrison already seated behind his desk in chambers. A court clerk sat in the corner, prepared to transcribe the proceedings, while a stern-looking man in an expensive suit stood by the window, presumably Blackwell's lawyer. The man turned as they entered, his professional demeanor never slipping despite the unusual nature of the case. "Mr. Pratt, representing Mr. Victor Blackwell," he introduced himself with a curt nod. Moments later, the main door opened, and Victor Blackwell himself entered, flanked by his 2 gunmen. Eliza tensed beside Ethan, her hand finding his and squeezing tightly as she faced her tormentor for the first time since her escape. Blackwell's eyes fixed on her immediately, his handsome face hardening with a mixture of rage and possessiveness that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. Here was a man used to owning everything he desired, to whom the concept of another's freedom was an affront to his very nature. "Gentlemen, please be seated," Judge Harrison instructed, his tone brooking no argument. "This is an informal hearing to determine the validity of Mrs. Blackwell's petition for annulment on grounds of fraud, specifically the charge that Mr. Blackwell misrepresented the source of his wealth prior to their marriage." "This is absurd, Your Honor," Pratt interjected smoothly. "My client is a respected businessman whose wife has been kidnapped and coerced into making false accusations. We demand her immediate return to her husband's custody while any claims she wishes to make can be properly investigated." "Your objection is noted, Mr. Pratt," Harrison replied evenly. "However, this court has already issued an injunction protecting Mrs. Blackwell based on evidence of physical danger. That injunction remains in effect during these proceedings. Blackwell leaned forward, his voice silky but dangerous. "Eliza, darling, you know this is all a misunderstanding." "Whatever this. Rancher has told you whatever he's forced you to say, I forgive you. Come home with me now and we'll put this unfortunate episode behind us." Eliza's grip on Ethan's hand tightened painfully, but when she spoke, her voice was steady. "I'm not going anywhere with you, Victor." "Not now, not ever." Blackwell's expression darkened. "You're my wife," he said, as if stating an immutable fact. "You belong with me." "That's precisely what this hearing will determine, Mr. Blackwell," Harrison interrupted. "Now, I have reviewed the evidence presented by Mrs. Blackwell regarding certain mining operations conducted by your company prior to your marriage. I have here banking records, correspondence, and a sworn affidavit from Thomas Wainwright of First National Bank of Cheyenne." Blackwell's composure slipped momentarily at the mention of Wainwright's name. "Wainwright has no authority to disclose confidential banking matters," he objected. "Any such disclosure is inadmissible." "On the contrary," Harrison countered. "Mr. Wainwright was legally obligated to report evidence of fraud once it came to his attention. His affidavit details how your company promoted mining investments based on falsified surveys, then sold your shares before the inevitable collapse." "This is preposterous," Blackwell scoffed. "Business setbacks happen. Not every mine produces as expected. These particular setbacks happened with remarkable regularity," Harrison observed dryly, "and always after you and your associates had divested your interests. Moreover, I have a confession from a surveyor named Jenkins who admits to falsifying reports at your direction." As the judge continued detailing the evidence, Blackwell's face grew increasingly rigid with suppressed fury. When Harrison finally paused, Blackwell turned to his lawyer, who rose to speak. "Your Honor, these allegations, even if true, have no bearing on the validity of Mr. Blackwell's marriage. Financial disputes between business partners are not grounds for annulment." "That would be correct," Harrison agreed, "if Mrs. Blackwell were seeking a divorce. But she is seeking an annulment on grounds of fraud specifically, that Mr. Blackwell deliberately misrepresented the source of his wealth, presenting himself as a legitimate businessman when in fact he was engaged in criminal activities." He turned to Eliza. "Mrs. Blackwell, when you married Mr. Blackwell, were you aware that his business activities included mining fraud?" "No, Your Honor," Eliza replied firmly. "Victor represented himself as a successful, honest businessman. I would never have married him had I known his wealth came from cheating others." "Your Honor, this is absurd," Pratt protested. "My client's business dealings, whatever their nature, were not a material factor in their marriage." "I disagree," Harrison said. "A woman has the right to know the moral character of the man she's marrying, particularly when that character might expose her to criminal proceedings or social disgrace." He shuffled the papers before him. "The evidence clearly establishes that Mr. Blackwell was engaged in fraudulent activities before his marriage, activities he concealed from his prospective bride. This constitutes fraud in the inducement of marriage." Blackwell surged to his feet, his control finally snapping. "She is my wife." He snarled. "No piece of paper you sign will change that. She belongs to me." "Mr. Blackwell, control yourself," Harrison warned sharply. "This is a court of law," but Blackwell was beyond heeding warnings. His hand moved toward his jacket, and in that instant, Ethan realized he was reaching for a concealed weapon. Without conscious thought, Ethan lunged forward, tackling Blackwell to the ground just as a shot rang out, the bullet embedding itself in the wall behind where Judge Harrison had been sitting. Chaos erupted in the small chamber. Sheriff Jenkins and his deputies burst in, weapons drawn. Blackwell's gunmen reached for their revolvers, but froze when they found themselves facing multiple barrels. Eliza screamed Ethan's name as he grappled with Blackwell on the floor. The two men locked in a desperate struggle for control of the small derringer Blackwell had pulled. A second shot discharged, and Ethan felt a searing pain in his side. But adrenaline and determination kept him fighting, his hands locked around Blackwell's wrist, forcing the weapon away. With a final surge of strength, he slammed Blackwell's hand against the floor, causing the derringer to skitter across the wooden boards. Sheriff Jenkins was there in an instant, hauling Blackwell to his feet and into handcuffs. "Victor Blackwell, you're under arrest for attempted murder of a federal judge," he announced grimly. "And anything else I can think to charge you with before we reach the jail." Only then did Ethan become aware of the warm wetness spreading across his shirt. He looked down to see blood seeping from a wound in his lower left side, just above his hip. "Ethan," Eliza was beside him, her face pale with fear as she pressed her hands against the wound. "Oh God, you're hit." "It's not bad," he assured her, though the pain was intensifying as the shock wore off. "Just a graze like yours." But it was more than a graze, as became apparent when he tried to stand and nearly collapsed. Judge Harrison called for a doctor while Sheriff Jenkins's deputies took charge of Blackwell and his men, escorting them forcibly from the chamber. Blackwell's voice drifted back as he was led away, still threatening, still claiming ownership. "This isn't over, Eliza. You'll always be mine." Eliza ignored him, her attention focused entirely on Ethan as she helped him to a chair, maintaining pressure on his wound. "Stay with me," she murmured. "Please, Ethan, I can't lose you now." "You won't," he promised, though his voice was weaker than he would have liked. "Takes more than this to keep me from our future." Judge Harrison approached, his face solemn but with a hint of satisfaction. "Before we were so dramatically interrupted, I was about to render my decision." He looked at Eliza. "Based on the evidence presented, I am granting your petition for annulment on grounds of fraud. Your marriage to Victor Blackwell is hereby declared null and void, as if it had never existed." Despite the chaos in Ethan's injury, joy bloomed across Eliza's face. "Truly, I'm free." "Legally, yes," Harrison confirmed, "though I suspect Mr. Blackwell will face far more serious charges than marriage fraud after today's display." He glanced at Ethan with genuine concern. "Let's get you to a doctor, Mr. Zimmerman. You've more than earned the right to enjoy the future you fought so hard to secure." The town doctor declared Ethan fortunate the bullet had passed through the fleshy part of his side without hitting any vital organs. With proper rest and care, he would make a full recovery, though riding would be uncomfortable for some weeks. They remained in Laramie while Ethan recuperated, staying in Judge Harrison's sister's boarding house. During that time, word reached them that Victor Blackwell had been charged with multiple counts of attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy. With his criminal activities exposed, former business partners and investors came forward with additional accusations, ensuring that even if he somehow escaped the attempted murder charge, he would spend years in prison for his financial crimes. "It's really over," Eliza marveled one evening as she changed Ethan's bandages. 2 weeks had passed since the hearing, and his wound was healing well, though he still winced when he moved too quickly. "Sometimes I can hardly believe it." "Believe it," Ethan said, catching her hand and bringing it to his lips. "You're free, Eliza, free to go wherever you want, be whoever you want to be." She met his gaze steadily. "I know exactly where I want to be and who I want to be with." She smiled, a full, genuine smile unmarred by fear or hesitation. "I want to go home, Ethan, to the Lazy Z, to our life together. Are you sure?" he asked, searching her face. "You've been someone's wife before, been trapped by those vows. I don't want you to feel obligated or rushed." "This is different," Eliza said softly. "What I feel for you, what we've built together, it's nothing like what I had with Victor. It's not a cage, it's a shelter, not confinement, but freedom." She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. "I love you, Ethan Zimmerman. And I want to spend my life with you if you'll have me. If I'll have you," Ethan repeated incredulously. "Eliza, loving you is the easiest, most natural thing I've ever done. It's like breathing, like the sunrise, inevitable and necessary and beautiful." He cupped her face in his hands. "I would be honored to share my life with you, to build something new together at the Lazy Z." 3 days later, with Ethan well enough to travel slowly, they stood before Judge Harrison once more, this time not for a legal proceeding, but for a simple, heartfelt wedding ceremony. Martha had arrived from the ranch, bringing news that all was well at the Lazy Z and tears of joy, at seeing them safe and finally free to love each other openly. Sheriff Jenkins stood as witness alongside Martha and Mrs. Parker, his gruff exterior softening as Ethan and Eliza exchanged vows that were all the more meaningful for the trials they had overcome to speak them. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Wyoming," Harrison concluded with evident satisfaction, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." As Ethan gathered Eliza into his arms for their first kiss as a married couple, he whispered the words that had begun their journey together. "My arms are your shelter, now and always." "And my heart is your home," she replied, sealing their promise with a kiss that held all the hope and possibility of their shared future. The journey back to the Lazy Z was taken in easy stages to accommodate Ethan's healing wound. When they finally crested the ridge overlooking the ranch, the sight of home brought tears to both their eyes, not just because of the beauty of the land stretching before them, but because of what it represented: safety, belonging, a future built on love and mutual respect. As word spread of their return, and of the dramatic events that had led to Blackwell's arrest, and Eliza's freedom, neighbors from miles around came to offer congratulations and welcome the new Mrs. Zimmerman to the community. The generosity and acceptance they showed convinced Eliza that she had truly found a place where she belonged, where she could put down roots and flourish. In the months that followed, the ranch prospered under their joint care. Eliza's education and quick mind proved valuable in managing the business aspects of the operation, while Ethan's practical knowledge and hard work continued to make the land productive. Together, they made improvements to the house, adding a larger kitchen and a small library where Eliza began teaching neighboring children who had limited access to formal schooling. When spring arrived, bringing new calves to the herd and wildflowers to the prairie, it also brought news that Eliza was expecting their first child. The joy that filled the Lazy Z was palpable, shared by Martha, who immediately began knitting baby clothes, and the ranch hands, who constructed a cradle as a surprise gift. On a warm September evening, nearly 2 years to the day since Ethan had found Eliza faint in that sun-drenched field, their son was born, a healthy, strong-lunged boy they named Thomas, after the banker whose courage had helped secure their happiness. As Ethan held his wife and newborn son in the golden light of sunset, he marveled at how completely his life had changed from the solitary existence he had once led. The ranch was no longer just a piece of land to be worked and improved, but the foundation of a legacy, a home where love, respect, and freedom flourished. "What are you thinking?" Eliza asked softly, noticing his contemplative expression as he gazed at their sleeping child. "About how lucky I am," Ethan replied, brushing a kiss against her temple. "About how finding you that day was the beginning of everything good in my life." Eliza smiled, leaning against his shoulder as they watched their son dream his first dreams. "Do you remember what you said to me that day? When I was afraid and alone. Then my arms are your shelter," Ethan recalled, tightening his embrace around his family. "You meant it then, and you've proven it every day since," Eliza said. "But what I never expected was how much shelter I would find in loving you, not the confinement I once knew, but the freedom to be fully myself, to grow and change and build a life of my own choosing." Outside, the Wyoming sky deepened to twilight, stars appearing one by one above the Lazy Z ranch. Inside, in the warm circle of lamplight, Ethan and Eliza Zimmerman held their son and each other, secure in the knowledge that the shelter they had created together, built on courage, sacrifice, and unwavering love, would endure through whatever challenges the future might bring. For Eliza, who had once been found faint in a field with little hope of escape from her past, and for Ethan, who had offered his arms as shelter without knowing how completely that simple act would transform both their lives, this quiet moment of shared joy was the fulfillment of a promise and the beginning of a legacy that would flourish for generations to come on the wind-swept prairie they called home.